I'm Jared, and I'm going to be refuting Monraj's claim, which was that strict gun control laws significantly lower violence. His three secondary claims were that 1, there would be lower gun-related deaths if there were less guns, 2, violent crimes would decrease if there are fewer guns, and 3, strict laws would make it harder for people to get guns, and that the current laws are inefficient. So, in response to his first claim that there would be lower gun-related deaths if there were less guns, during his presentation, he had referenced a claim from the JAMA network about gun legislation and gun-related fatalities, where he stated, states with stricter gun laws had fewer deaths as compared to states with lax gun control laws had more deaths. And after examining the study, while it showed an association did exist, the study itself states that they could not determine a cause and effect relationship. Furthermore, the study decided to include suicides rather than just homicides alone. And this factor would skew the results because his primary proposition is about lowering violence, not suicide or gun-related deaths in general. In addition to this, I found some evidence that actually counters his claim. In Washington, D.C. enacted a gun law in 1976 that prohibited the possession of all handguns and also required all firearms in private homes to be unloaded and rendered temporarily inoperable. This basically meant that if you had a handgun or any type of gun, it wasn't going to be ready for you to use it at the moment's notice. The law was struck down by the Supreme Court in 2008. According to a statistic from Just Facts, who constructed the statistic with data from the FBI's Uniform Crime Reporting Program, between 1976, when the law was passed, and 2008, when it was struck down, the Washington, D.C. murder rate averaged 73% higher than it was before passing the law, while the U.S. murder rate averaged 11% lower during this time. In 1982, Chicago instituted a ban on handguns that prevented civilians from possessing handguns except for those that were already registered with the city. And even those handguns still had to be registered every year, otherwise they forfeited their right to it. The ban was struck down in 2010 by the Supreme Court, according to Just Facts, which constructed the statistic with the data that was presented in the McDonald versus Chicago case that overturned the ban between 1982 when it was passed and 2008, which is when they could compile the data from. The percentage of Chicago murders committed with handguns averaged 40% higher than it was before the ban, the ban was passed. Both these statistics are prime counterexamples for major cities that, in the case where laws were passed to cut down on the possession of firearms, deaths related to firearms actually increased. His second point, which violent crimes would decrease if there are fewer guns, I found that there were some problems with the reasoning because primarily that firearms are not a prerequisite to violent crimes. Criminals in societies that do not have guns readily available will resort to other means to carry out crime. Some evidence that supports this is that in 1968, Britain passed laws that strictly limited firearm possession by requiring civilians to acquire a certificate from their district police chief. Basically, you had to go talk to your district police chief, give him good reason why you needed a firearm, and he could still say no. In 1997, Britain passed a law that required the surrender of all privately owned handguns. According to Just Facts, which constructed the statistic from data from the United Kingdom Home Office, between 1968 passing the law and 2008, the homicide rate averaged 52% higher than before the passing of this law. And for the 1997 handgun ban, between 1997 and 2008, the homicide rate was 15% higher than before the ban. In a report to the United Kingdom's House of Commons, it was stated that since 1967, homicide figures for England and Wales have been adjusted to exclude any cases which do not result in a conviction. So whereas here in the US, the FBI considers anything where there's a dead person that was caused by the willful killing of one human being by another, that's a murder. Whereas in England, they don't. It's all based on conviction, and because of this, the homicide rate might actually be higher than what's reported. These statistics show that the removal of firearms would not lower violent crimes, since criminals in society that do not possess them will simply switch over to other means such as knives or blunt objects. According to the website of the United Kingdom's Parliament, in 2012, there were 29,000 recorded offenses, including knives alone. The Guardian states that hospitals do not have to report knife-related crime, and as a result, the numbers could actually be a lot higher. In 1987, Florida passed a right to carry law, which requires those who can receive a concealed carry permit be 21 years of age, have a clean criminal record, and along with mental health records, and complete a firearm safety course. As of 2010, Florida has 746,000 active permit holders, which is roughly 5.4% of the population. According to Just Facts, which constructed the statistic with data from the FBI's Uniform Crime Reporting Program, between the passing of the law in 1987 and 2008, the murder rate in Florida has averaged 36% lower than before, while the U.S. rate has averaged about 15% lower. Okay. And Juan Rogers' third point was that strict laws will make it harder for people to get guns. The current laws are inefficient. Some evidence that I found to counter this is that based off production estimates, there's currently about 270 million guns in private ownership circulation. Criminals can still easily acquire firearms through private sales, illegal sources, or just taking them from family and friends, all sources that can't be effectively regulated. A 1997 U.S. Justice Department survey of 14,000 state prison inmates found that among those inmates who carried a firearm during the offense for which they were sent to jail, 39% acquired the weapon from an illegal street source, and 39% through family or friends. Another point that I would like to bring up is Mexico. Mexico has some of the strictest gun laws in the world, with citizens only eligible to buy from a small list of non-military weapons after they're approved by the Defense Ministry, who's going to perform extensive background checks. The 2012 article from The Guardian states that 54% of homicides in Mexico were committed by a firearm, with a rate of about nine people per 100,000 killed by firearm. As a result, in a country where the estimated amount of firearms is 15 million. By contrast, in America, where the number of firearms in ownership is 270 million, the percentage killed by a firearm is 60%, with a rate of 2 per 100,000 million, or 100,000. So even though we have a significantly higher amount of firearms, we don't have a higher rate of people killed per 100,000 as compared to Mexico. He also brought up points that about mentally ill acquiring firearms, and that background checks would help against this. The Sandy Hook shooting, however, was a result of a mentally ill person acquiring a firearm from a family member, and that the background checks don't work unless the states agree to provide that kind of information for the national background check system. And so, in conclusion, while I can agree that gun control laws could be a factor in lowering violence, they're not going to significantly lower violence, and they're not the only factor that needs to be added to combat this kind of crimes that are being committed. Thank you.
Well, this is the point where I should be finishing my comments instead of just beginning them, because you did go substantially over time. So I'm going to try and keep this brief. I'm going to make the same comment I made a little bit earlier to another speaker. Your exit claim seems to run exactly contrary to all of the argument that you made in attempting to be conciliatory with the advocate's position and maybe sound like you were just being, well, I'm just making a claim here. You basically ignore all of the data that you presented, which seemed to be pretty substantial, that suggests that there is no link between the amount of guns that are possessed and the amount of crime that is occurring, which is, a definitive rejection of the claim that the advocate's presenting. So I don't know why you're conceding anything on that last point. The first 2 points, you've got just a ton of examples that you're using and a lot of statistical data that demonstrates your point. The only thing that I think is missing is a little bit more contrast to the data that the advocate used? What information did they use to cite their points? You probably have overdone it a little bit. You could have gotten away with maybe half as much on each of those points, and then you'd have had time to get to that last issue as it was. I thought that the statistical comparison between Mexico and the United States at the end was an interesting one, because that directly flies in the face of the claim that, less guns equals fewer crime, and that's basically the position that the advocate took. Once again, you've got a good piece of data. I don't know what the data is that the advocate offered, and you ought to be making a contrast a little bit more on that. All right, I'm going to keep that there. That's going to be it.